Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I woke up knowing something had already happened to me, even though the morning looked ordinary enough to deny it. The ceiling fan was ticking the way it always did, one click-off rhythm, and the pale rectangle of light on the wall told me my mother had already been up, already moving through the house with the quiet efficiency she'd learned after years of raising a son who preferred silence to conversation. Nothing about the room had changed, and yet my chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath through a dream that hadn't entirely let go. I didn't know then that the dream hadn't been mine. For most of my life, I had believed identity was something you declared once and then defended, like a border. You picked a side, learned the rules, and stayed within them because leaving meant confusion, disappointment, or worse, a kind of moral failure. I had learned that lesson early, not because my parents enforced it harshly, but because the world rewarded conformity with ease. As Mike, I knew where to stand, how to speak, how to move through space without attracting attention. It was a quiet competence, the kind that never draws praise but keeps you safe. Still, there were moments, small, unremarkable ones, that never fit cleanly inside that border. A pause in front of a mirror that lasted too long. A strange envy that arrived uninvited when I noticed how freely some people expressed themselves. An ache I couldn't name that felt less like desire and more like unfinished business. I learned to file those moments away, to tell myself everyone has stray thoughts, and that maturity meant not indulging them. That morning, though, the filing system failed. At breakfast, my mother sat across from me with her coffee untouched, studying my face with an expression I'd only seen a handful of times, when she was deciding whether to say something that couldn't be taken back. The house smelled faintly of toast, and the radio murmured from the kitchen counter, filling the silence neither of us seemed ready to break. "You slept okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said, because that was the answer I'd always given. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Her gaze lingered, not intrusive, just attentive in a way that made me suddenly self-conscious, like I'd forgotten to button a shirt that was already closed. Finally, she smiled in a careful, almost apologetic way. "I had a strange dream," she said. "About you." I felt my shoulders tighten before I could stop them. Dreams about other people have a way of feeling like accusations, even when they're harmless. "Yeah." She hesitated, then laughed softly, as if embarrassed by her own imagination. "You were different. Not in a bad way. Just," she searched for the word, stirring her coffee though it had long gone cold. "You were Melissa." The name landed with a weight I didn't expect. Not because it was shocking, but because it felt oddly precise, like a key turned in a lock I hadn't known was there. I told myself it was just a name, just a dream, but my pulse had already quickened, betraying me. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "In the dream, you were still you," she said quickly, as if reassuring both of us. "Same habits, same expressions. But you were living as a woman. Confident, but thoughtful. Like you'd thought about it for a long time." I stared at my plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern in the ceramic. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to make a joke that would restore the familiar balance between us. Another part, the one I'd spent years pretending didn't exist, was listening with a kind of reverence. "It doesn't mean anything," she added. "Dreams are just dreams." I nodded, grateful for the exit she'd offered, and we finished breakfast talking about mundane things, errands, weather, a neighbor's new dog. But the name followed me long after I left the table. Melissa. It echoed softly, not demanding attention, just waiting. The rest of the day unfolded as it always did. I went through my routines with practiced ease, responding to people the way they expected, performing competence like a well-rehearsed role. Yet beneath it all, something had shifted. The dream, my mother's dream, had cracked open a question I could no longer dismiss as hypothetical. What if identity wasn't a border, but a conversation? That night, alone in my room, I found myself thinking back over moments I'd once dismissed as trivial. The first time I'd felt a quiet relief watching a woman speak honestly about her struggles with self-definition. The strange calm that settled over me when I imagined myself without the expectations that came with being Mike. None of these memories were dramatic. They didn't arrive with fanfare or certainty. They were simply there, waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't decide anything that night. There was no vow, no declaration. Just a recognition that the dream had given language to something I'd never allowed myself to articulate. And with that recognition came responsibility, to myself, and eventually, to others. Because pretending not to know something once you know it isn't neutrality, it's avoidance. When I finally turned off the light, the name surfaced again, gentle and insistent. I didn't claim it. I didn't reject it. I let it exist alongside me, an unanswered question that felt, for the first time, worth asking. In the days after my mother told me about her dream, time seemed to slow in a way that made ordinary moments feel unusually deliberate, as if each one were asking me whether I was paying attention. I found myself noticing things I'd previously moved past without thought, the way my reflection shifted depending on my posture, the different versions of myself that appeared depending on who I was with, the small negotiations I made internally before speaking. None of this was new, but it had acquired a kind of gravity, like familiar furniture rearranged just enough to make me stumble. I didn't tell anyone about the dream. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because I didn't yet know what it was. Sharing it would have forced me to frame it as something funny, troubling, meaningful, and I wasn't ready to choose. Instead, I carried it quietly, letting it surface in unexpected places. While waiting in line at the grocery store. While folding laundry. While brushing my teeth and catching my own eyes in the mirror, searching for something I couldn't define. What unsettled me most was how calm I felt. I had expected anxiety, or excitement, or some dramatic emotional spike that would signal I was standing at the edge of a major life event. Instead, there was a steady, thoughtful curiosity, like realizing you've been mispronouncing your own name for years and wondering what else you might have gotten slightly wrong. The absence of panic made it harder to dismiss the questions as fleeting or irrational. One evening, while my mother was out visiting a friend, I wandered into her room without a clear reason. It wasn't something I usually did. Her room felt like neutral territory, neither forbidden nor inviting, and stepping into it felt oddly symbolic, though I couldn't have explained why. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the late afternoon light softened the edges of everything it touched. I stood there for a long moment, hands in my pockets, feeling faintly ridiculous. This wasn't about clothes or objects, I told myself. This was about understanding. About honesty. Still, I opened her closet, more out of a desire to confront my own hesitation than any concrete plan. The sight inside wasn't dramatic, neatly arranged clothes, practical shoes, a few things she'd kept for years out of sentiment rather than use. I didn't touch anything at first. I just looked. What struck me wasn't longing or excitement, but recognition. These were tools of expression, no more inherently meaningful than the shirts and jeans in my own closet, yet somehow imbued with permission I'd never granted myself. The permission to be seen differently. The permission to choose presentation as an act of intention rather than default. When I finally reached out, it was with a carefulness that surprised me. I selected a simple cardigan, soft, neutral, unassuming, and held it against my chest, feeling its weight, its texture. There was no rush of revelation, no cinematic moment. Just a quiet sense of alignment, as if something had settled into place without announcement. I put it back almost immediately, my heart beating faster than the action warranted. Not from fear of being caught, but from the realization that I had crossed an internal line. I had acted, however briefly, on a curiosity I'd long denied. And once an action exists, it can't be unimagined. That night, lying in bed, I thought about my mother's dream again. About how she'd said I was confident, thoughtful. Not transformed into someone else, but expanded. The idea lingered, challenging my assumption that exploring this part of myself would require rejecting everything I'd been before. What if it was additive rather than subtractive? What if becoming more honest didn't mean becoming less responsible? Over the following weeks, I began to experiment in ways so subtle they were almost invisible. I paid attention to how I moved, how I spoke, how I responded emotionally to things I'd once brushed off. I noticed how often I'd learned to suppress softness in myself, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't fit the role I'd been assigned and had accepted without question. Letting myself feel it didn't make me weaker, it made me more present. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, I'd argue with myself, questioning motives and consequences. Was this self-indulgence? Was I creating a problem where none existed? But those questions always returned to the same place. Ignoring something persistent doesn't make it disappear, it just pushes it into the background, where it influences you without accountability. Facing it, even uncertainly, felt more ethical than pretending it wasn't there. Eventually, the name surfaced again, not as a label to adopt, but as a reference point. Melissa wasn't a destination, she was a question mark, a way of imagining myself outside the narrow confines I'd accepted. Thinking of her helped me articulate feelings that had previously been shapeless. She represented intention. Choice. The courage to be examined without being sensationalized. I didn't wake up one morning transformed. There was no announcement, no turning point that could be neatly summarized. What changed was my relationship to uncertainty. I stopped treating it as a threat and started treating it as information. Each moment of discomfort became a signal worth investigating rather than suppressing. Looking back, I can see how this period taught me patience, not just with myself, but with the people around me. I began to understand how easily we misread others, how often we mistake silence for simplicity. That realization softened my judgments, made me more attentive, more careful with assumptions I'd once considered harmless. By the time I realized I needed to talk to my mother, not about the dream itself, but about what it had stirred, I also understood that whatever happened next would require honesty tempered with empathy. Not just the courage to speak, but the responsibility to listen. Because identity doesn't exist in isolation, it unfolds within relationships, shaped by trust and care. The conversation hadn't happened yet. But the ground had shifted beneath me, and I knew I couldn't stand still forever. Something had been set in motion, not by a dramatic act, but by a quiet willingness to look inward and stay there long enough to learn. The days after I began really noticing myself in this way stretched long and uneven, like a road that curves around hills you didn't know existed. I carried Melissa silently, not as a name to claim yet, but as a presence that softened the edges of my certainty. Each morning I woke, the thought of her lingered, not intrusive, not overwhelming, just quietly insistent, like a shadow following me down a familiar street. I started with small experiments, gestures invisible to most people, but meaningful to me. A pause before speaking, letting my tone settle where it felt honest rather than habitual. Standing differently, allowing my shoulders to relax rather than coil in automatic self-defense. I began noticing the ways people moved around me, how friends unconsciously mirrored posture, how strangers adjusted distance based on unspoken cues, and how much my own movements shaped their responses. It was terrifying and exhilarating to realize that identity could ripple outward without words, that the self we carried wasn't just internal but social, relational, alive in the spaces we occupied. One afternoon, I found myself wandering into a boutique I had passed 100 times without thought. I told myself it was curiosity, but I knew curiosity had motives. The store smelled faintly of cedar and fabric softener, and the soft music overhead seemed calibrated to make you linger. I touched scarves, folded shirts, lingered over materials I had no practical reason to consider. No one paid me any mind, and yet I felt intensely observed, as if the objects themselves registered my hesitation and willingness at once. A simple gesture, a sleeve brushing my wrist, the light catching a particular color, brought a wave of emotion I couldn't name. It wasn't longing or shame, it was recognition. For the first time, I realized that expression could be comforting, not performative. Clothes could be tools of self-exploration rather than armor or camouflage. I didn't buy anything that day. I didn't need to. The experience itself was enough, proof that I could inhabit the world slightly differently, without declaration, without judgment. Returning home, I felt restless in a way that no small act could settle. I began journaling, tentatively at first, using language I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I wrote not about clothes or appearances, but about sensation, the way my chest felt when I realized I could speak more softly without shrinking, the tension that dissolved when I allowed a thought to drift fully into consciousness, the quiet, almost imperceptible relief that came from admitting curiosity without fear. My handwriting wavered between precise loops and hurried scrawls, reflecting the mixture of control and surrender I was learning to navigate. I also started noticing how the people closest to me responded to subtle shifts. My friends, those I had known for years, were remarkably perceptive. A comment here, a glance there, suggested awareness without confrontation. Some responded with warmth, others with curiosity, and a few with distance, though none confronted me directly. And that distance wasn't always hostility, it was uncertainty, the kind that mirrors our own internal questions back at us. Each reaction was a mirror, teaching me how identity is not only lived internally but interpreted externally. My mother remained the quietest, the most steady presence in this evolving landscape. She didn't pressure me, didn't ask pointed questions, but her small gestures carried meaning, a thoughtful glance, a cup of tea set just so, an absent-minded question about my day that invited reflection rather than demanded performance. I began to understand how much of care exists in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Responsibility toward others wasn't just about obligation, it was about attentiveness, empathy, and the courage to act without applause. One night, I found myself standing in front of my mirror for what felt like an hour. Not to examine appearance, though I saw it, but to confront reflection itself. I practiced small movements, shifting my posture, experimenting with expression, letting my body feel possibilities I had never allowed it. Each gesture carried both apprehension and fascination. I noticed the slight tension in my jaw, the tilt of my head, the way my eyes softened when I imagined Melissa stepping into the room instead of Mike. It was terrifying, because each moment of recognition forced accountability. I could not pretend these feelings were temporary, insignificant, or easily dismissed. I had been given a glimpse of a self I had not yet fully met, and ignoring that glimpse was no longer an option. The reflection staring back at me was familiar and strange at once, a convergence of past self and emerging possibility. In the following weeks, I began to move outward cautiously. Small choices at home, wearing softer colors, letting my voice vary more naturally, adjusting the cadence of speech. Small choices in public, noticing how others reacted, learning to navigate attention without pretending it didn't exist. I became fascinated with how authenticity shapes perception, how honesty, even partial honesty, alters both inner experience and external consequence. And yet, every choice carried tension. Even minor acts of self-expression seemed weighted by social risk. I feared misunderstanding, misjudgment, disappointment, even if the world at large was indifferent. I feared disappointing myself, more terrifying than any external response, because I had spent years building a version of Mike that functioned, and any alteration felt like a betrayal and a liberation at once. Through it all, Melissa persisted as a presence in my mind. Not a mask, not a persona, but a lens, a way of observing myself from an expanded perspective. She asked questions I could not yet answer. Who am I willing to become? How do I navigate authenticity without abandoning care for others? What does it mean to act with courage in spaces that may not understand? Her persistence was gentle, almost imperceptible, but insistent enough that ignoring it no longer felt possible. By the time I found myself writing a letter to my mother, one I would never send, but used as a practice in articulation, I realized that identity is never a fixed point. It is a river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, always moving, reshaping the banks of our understanding. The act of naming, of acknowledging, of exploring, these were not frivolous. They were ethical. They were human. And somewhere in the quiet reflection of that night, I felt the first real sense of responsibility not only to myself but to others. If I could navigate this space with honesty, empathy, and attention, I could live in a way that honored both self and connection. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. The work ahead was immense, because it required patience, courage, and relentless attention to nuance. But the alternative, denial, erasure, avoidance, was no longer acceptable. Melissa was still a question. She was still uncertain. She would remain so for a long time. But for the first time, I didn't fear that uncertainty. I recognized it as part of the journey, the ethical, human, deeply complicated journey of understanding oneself in relation to the world. The weeks that followed were neither dramatic nor sudden, they were accumulations of quiet choices and subtle observations that collectively reshaped how I understood myself. The change was invisible to most people, but to me it was tectonic, like shifting soil beneath a house, imperceptible day to day, yet unmistakable in hindsight. I began to realize that transformation wasn't a single moment of revelation but a series of small acts of attention, each one building on the last. I started with mornings. I allowed myself to linger in them longer than usual, noticing the way sunlight entered my room, the sound of distant traffic, the weight of blankets around my body. I noticed how my voice sounded when I spoke softly to myself, how my breath shifted when I didn't suppress it. These were small acts of permission, letting myself exist fully in ways I had always restrained. I found a strange, almost sacred rhythm in observing my own experience, like tracing the contours of a coastline I hadn't previously mapped. Work and social life required a careful balance. Nothing external had changed, I was still Mike in most practical senses, but internally I was learning to inhabit multiple layers of myself simultaneously. I noticed micro-choices in posture, in tone, in gesture, in how I allowed or withheld attention. Some colleagues responded subtly, others not at all. I began to understand that identity, though deeply personal, is also relational. Each person perceives you through their own expectations and biases, and navigating that perception ethically demands attentiveness without capitulation. Home life became an arena of reflection. My mother remained quietly observant, offering small, unobtrusive cues that conveyed care and understanding. She didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer, she simply existed as a witness, and in doing so she taught me that validation doesn't always come in words. There were nights when I would catch her watching me with a look that carried both pride and uncertainty, and those glances became anchors, reminders that honesty is not a solitary act. I began experimenting with clothing, not in any theatrical sense, but in subtle ways that felt like internal alignment. A softer fabric, a color I had previously avoided, a pattern that resonated with an emotion I hadn't yet named. Each choice carried significance not because it was visible to anyone else, but because it reinforced my capacity to inhabit my own body with attentiveness and intention. The act of choosing became a practice of ethical self-awareness, noticing how each decision reflected desire, apprehension, or comfort, and weighing those impulses with care. Social situations became exercises in nuance. I observed how people interpreted tone, gaze, and movement, and how my own subtle shifts influenced the dynamic. I learned that authenticity is never simply about expressing a hidden truth, it is also about understanding context, anticipating consequences, and acting with integrity. The ethical dimension of identity became increasingly clear, every choice I made carried ripple effects, and every action was an opportunity to practice empathy, for myself and for others. At times, the tension was palpable. I feared misperception, misunderstanding, or judgment, yet I also feared erasure, the kind of self-denial that had been my default for years. Each act of attention was a negotiation, a balancing of honesty, courage, and relational sensitivity. The stakes were both internal and external. Failing myself could perpetuate shame or disconnection, failing others could cause harm or confusion. The work was relentless, demanding, and infinitely nuanced. I also began confronting internalized assumptions about gender, expression, and morality. I questioned why softness in a man had been discouraged, why curiosity about other ways of being felt dangerous, why the act of exploring identity had to be framed in extremes, either fully conforming or fully rebelling. In unpacking these layers, I discovered a moral imperative, to honor complexity rather than simplify it, to live responsibly without shrinking, to act with courage without arrogance. Melissa existed here, as a lens through which I could examine assumptions and expand understanding. She was neither a fantasy nor a disguise, she was a tool of empathy, a framework for reflection, a means of exploring ethical selfhood. One afternoon, I found myself at a park, observing families and strangers with a new attentiveness. I noticed how gestures of care, hand-holding, gentle touch, protective glances, carried meaning beyond words. I noticed how people moved in spaces of both constraint and freedom, negotiating societal expectations in ways I had barely recognized before. In that observation, I felt a profound humility. Identity is relational, and awareness of others is inseparable from awareness of self. To inhabit Melissa, even partially, even imaginatively, required attention to the lived reality of others, and that attention was humbling and clarifying. Sleep became another arena of reflection. Dreams, once trivialized, now seemed to carry lessons rather than illusions. I began keeping a small journal, recording fragments of thought, emotion, and reflection. Often, Melissa appeared, not as a fully realized self, but as a guide and interlocutor. She posed questions that demanded reflection. What am I avoiding? What am I honoring? Where does curiosity end and responsibility begin? Answering these questions required patience, honesty, and courage, and sometimes the answers arrived only in fragments, whispered by thought rather than declared with clarity. By the end of this period, I began to understand the central paradox of identity exploration. It is simultaneously intensely personal and inherently relational. Self-discovery cannot occur in isolation, it unfolds in conversation with others, in response to social cues, in ethical reflection on consequence. Melissa's presence allowed me to navigate that paradox. She was both mirror and lens, challenging me to act with attentiveness and integrity while exploring possibilities beyond the constraints of habit and expectation. And somewhere in this quiet, cumulative evolution, I realized that transformation was never a moment of spectacle. It was a slow, deliberate process of attention, ethical reflection, and empathy. Each choice mattered because each choice shaped the self I was becoming, incrementally, unassumingly, yet irrevocably. The journey was not about performance or approval, it was about alignment with an inner truth that demanded recognition and care. Melissa was still a question, still uncertain, still unclaimed. Yet for the first time, uncertainty no longer frightened me. It was the space in which ethical selfhood could emerge, the arena in which I could practice empathy, responsibility, and courage. It was, in its quiet way, a form of freedom, the freedom to explore, to observe, and to inhabit life without erasure. The months that followed were a careful negotiation between continuity and change, between the life I had always known as Mike and the new possibilities Melissa quietly suggested. I became intensely aware of the rhythms I had previously taken for granted, the way my days were structured, the unexamined habits that had guided me for years, the assumptions I carried about who I was and how the world saw me. I began to interrogate these patterns, not out of rebellion, but out of a desire for integrity, a desire to align lived experience with internal understanding. It started with speech. I noticed subtle patterns in the way I spoke, the tendency to dominate conversations without realizing it, the reflexive defensiveness when challenged, the unthinking precision that sometimes shut down emotional openness. I began experimenting with cadence, with pauses, with phrasing that allowed reflection rather than assertion. Sometimes it felt absurd, even awkward, and occasionally it drew puzzled looks from friends and colleagues. But these moments became opportunities to notice myself in interaction, to understand how identity operates in the relational world. Melissa was present here, too, guiding my awareness. She wasn't a persona to perform, she was a lens for self-observation, a subtle recalibration of attention toward honesty and empathy. Physical presence became another arena of learning. I started paying attention to how I moved, how I occupied space, how gestures communicated unspoken messages. It wasn't about a feminine or masculine behavior, those labels had always felt confining, but about alignment between intention and expression. If I felt calm, did my posture reflect it? If I felt anxious, did my hands betray tension? These inquiries were quiet, almost imperceptible, but each one sharpened my self-awareness. The body is never neutral, it is a medium of communication, a participant in identity formation, and I was learning to listen to it attentively. Clothing became more than mere utility. I began selecting fabrics, textures, and colors that resonated with emotion rather than expectation. A soft sweater, a scarf of muted tone, shoes that felt balanced on my feet, these choices were not dramatic statements, they were intimate exercises in self-recognition. I noticed how comfort could translate to confidence, how alignment between internal state and external presentation subtly shaped interactions with others. For the first time, attire felt like dialogue rather than disguise, a practice in mindfulness rather than display. At home, my mother's presence remained steady, quiet, and careful. She never pressed, never interrogated, never directed. Yet her attentiveness was palpable, a pause in conversation, a thoughtful smile, a hand resting briefly on the back of a chair where I had sat. She had witnessed the unfolding of a process she could not name, and her silence was not avoidance but recognition. That recognition taught me the ethics of witnessing, the way validation can exist without demand, how attention itself can be an act of care. Friendships became exercises in observation and integrity. I began noticing who adapted comfortably to subtle change, who resisted or recoiled, and how my responses influenced them in turn. These were not moral judgments, but empirical observations. Identity exists in interaction, and relational feedback shapes perception and choice. Some friends offered intuitive support, some remained neutral, some inadvertently revealed biases I had previously ignored. Each encounter reinforced the principle that selfhood is both internal and relational, and that ethical engagement requires attentiveness, patience, and courage. Emotionally, the process was intricate. I felt exhilaration at discovering new aspects of myself, apprehension at the social implications, and humility at the recognition of my own past blindness to nuance. Melissa became a companion in reflection, a way to observe emotional shifts without judgment. She was not a mask or a fantasy but an instrument for understanding. How do I navigate desire for authenticity alongside responsibility to others? How do I act with honesty without incurring harm? How do I inhabit spaces of ambiguity without defaulting to avoidance? These questions were constant, subtle, and unrelenting. Work offered another dimension. In meetings, in presentations, in casual hallway interactions, I began to notice how micro-adjustments, tone, posture, choice of language, changed perception. I learned to speak assertively while remaining open, to express ideas while leaving space for dialogue, to inhabit confidence without aggression. These were not performances of gender but exercises in ethical self-expression. Identity, I realized, is inseparable from practice. How one moves, speaks, and listens shapes both inner understanding and external effect. Even routine acts, cooking, cleaning, walking through the neighborhood, took on new significance. I became aware of gestures I had always taken for granted, the way I carried groceries, the way I navigated sidewalks crowded with strangers, the way I organized objects in my home. Each mundane act became a site of reflection. How am I showing attentiveness to myself? How am I showing respect to those around me? Small choices accumulated into habits of intentionality, shaping an ethical framework for daily living. There were moments of doubt and tension, of course. The fear of misperception never fully disappeared. I worried about judgment, misunderstanding, even ridicule. I worried about disappointing myself or others. But those fears were increasingly tempered by clarity. Avoiding awareness does not eliminate risk, it only compounds dissonance. To act with honesty, even incrementally, is to confront uncertainty with courage, and courage became a practice rather than an event. Melissa, though still unnamed aloud, became central to this practice. She existed as a reflective presence, a subtle guide in the ongoing experiment of selfhood. She reminded me that identity is iterative, never fully finished, always subject to discovery and ethical consideration. She helped me articulate experiences that previously lacked language, frame questions that had remained implicit, and inhabit ambiguity without despair. By this point, I recognized that transformation is fundamentally relational. It is shaped by observation, feedback, and ethical engagement. One cannot explore identity in isolation without losing perspective on consequence, empathy, or social reality. Melissa existed not as an escape from Mike, but as an expansion, a way to inhabit life more fully and responsibly. And so the months accumulated, quietly, persistently. Change was neither dramatic nor spectacular. It was not sudden, nor announced, nor applauded. It was lived. It was observed. It was measured in subtle acts of attention, reflection, and ethical negotiation. It was the slow, deliberate shaping of selfhood in alignment with curiosity, honesty, and empathy. By now, I had begun to feel something I had never experienced before, an integration of possibility and responsibility. Identity was no longer a static label, a border to defend, or a role to perform. It was an ongoing, ethical engagement with life, with self, with others. Melissa was still a question, still uncertain, still unnamed aloud, but her presence had shifted the terrain of my internal world. She was a guide, a lens, a companion in the work of living with attentiveness, courage, and integrity. By now, the presence of Melissa in my consciousness was no longer tentative. She had become a companion in the quiet work of observing, reflecting, and navigating the ethical complexities of living honestly. She wasn't a separate self to inhabit, but a lens through which I could see myself with clarity and depth, a tool for understanding the interplay between desire, responsibility, and perception. The ordinary moments became laboratories for exploration. Walking down familiar streets, I noticed how I carried my weight, how my eyes met, or avoided, those of strangers, how the smallest gestures signaled confidence, hesitation, or empathy. I experimented with subtle variations in posture, a tilt of the head, the way my hands rested at my sides, the cadence of my walk. These were not dramatic performances, not acts meant to draw attention. They were inquiries into self-presentation, into how internal alignment shapes external reality. Each moment became a study in presence, in authenticity, in relational awareness. Conversations with friends began to feel different. I noticed the micro-shifts in dialogue when I allowed vulnerability instead of automatic defense, when I admitted uncertainty rather than claiming authority. I observed reactions, sometimes curiosity, sometimes discomfort, and learned to navigate them without fear or pretense. Melissa's guidance was subtle. She helped me frame my attention on understanding rather than reacting, listening rather than asserting, questioning rather than judging. The process taught me that empathy is not passive, it is active, deliberate, and demanding. Home life deepened in its significance. My mother continued to exist as a silent witness, neither prying nor instructing. I began to sense that her attentiveness was itself a form of guidance, a model of how one can honor another's evolving self without forcing outcomes. I experimented with small acts of care, making tea for her just as she had made it for me countless times, noticing her routines and stepping into them without prompting, being present in ways that were quiet yet significant. These gestures were neither performative nor transactional, they were exercises in relational ethics, a practice in aligning presence with intention. At work, I began noticing subtleties I had previously ignored. The rhythm of meetings, the unspoken dynamics in team interactions, the interplay of tone, posture, and expression. I practiced speaking with clarity tempered by empathy, presenting ideas without asserting dominance, responding to challenges without defensiveness. These micro-adjustments weren't about gendered performance, they were about integrity, accountability, and relational mindfulness. Melissa's presence helped me remain conscious of the ethical dimension of communication, how one's internal alignment shapes the perception and experience of others. I began exploring self-expression through more deliberate acts. A scarf draped differently, a softer shade chosen deliberately, a hairstyle adjusted in quiet reflection, each choice was a meditation in subtlety. I didn't adopt these changes for attention or approval, I adopted them as exercises in alignment. How does what I show outwardly reflect what I feel inwardly? How can minor shifts in presentation cultivate authenticity without imposing expectation? Each adjustment became a lesson in observing consequence, in ethical self-awareness, and in the careful calibration of courage and discretion. Emotionally, I was stretched in ways both exhilarating and uncomfortable. Fear, doubt, and self-consciousness persisted, but they no longer commanded my actions. I had begun to inhabit uncertainty as a space for growth rather than threat. Melissa's presence offered perspective. She reminded me that internal questions are not obstacles but instruments of discovery, that discomfort is often a sign of attention, and that honesty, even in partial revelation, is a moral act. Socially, I became attuned to the ways subtle shifts in behavior and presence affected others. I noticed how small acts of attentiveness, listening without interrupting, acknowledging emotions without judgment, making space for difference, changed the quality of interactions. I learned that identity is inseparable from relational ethics. How we inhabit ourselves shapes the spaces we share, and being attentive to self requires equal attentiveness to others. Melissa was central here, not as a separate identity, but as a reminder to act with care, integrity, and thoughtfulness. Even mundane routines, making coffee, arranging books, walking the dog, took on reflective significance. Each gesture became a site for observing alignment, for testing authenticity, for practicing intentionality. I realized that identity isn't only about dramatic acts of revelation, it is lived in the repetition of small, conscientious choices. The moral dimension of everyday life became clearer. To inhabit the world responsibly is to act with awareness, empathy, and courage, even when no one is watching. sleep and dreams continued to offer lessons. I recorded fragments in a small journal, reflecting on thoughts that had previously gone unexamined. Melissa appeared occasionally, not as a fantasy but as a reflective presence, prompting questions: how am I honoring myself? How am I honoring those around me? Where does comfort meet responsibility? These reflections sharpened my capacity for ethical self-awareness, reinforcing the principle that exploration of identity is inseparable from relational mindfulness and moral consideration. By now, I had developed a rhythm of self-inquiry, reflection, observation, adjustment, and integration. Melissa was not a destination, not an endpoint, she was the ongoing process itself. The lens she provided allowed me to inhabit ambiguity without fear, to act with intention without coercion, to explore without erasure. Transformation was no longer a single moment but a continuous practice of attention, care, and courage. I began to recognize that the ultimate work of identity is relational. Every act of honesty, every exercise in vulnerability, every subtle adjustment in posture or tone, reverberates outward. Ethics and authenticity are inseparable. To live fully as oneself is simultaneously to navigate responsibility to others. Melissa guided me not with answers but with questions, reminding me that living with integrity demands ongoing observation, reflection, and courage. By the close of this period, uncertainty had become familiar. I no longer feared it, nor did I feel compelled to rush to conclusion. Melissa was a question, a presence, a lens for understanding that allowed me to inhabit life with attentiveness, ethical reflection, and empathy. Identity, I understood, is neither fixed nor performed, it is continuously lived, continuously negotiated, and continuously observed. The work is subtle, persistent, and profoundly human. It was in the quiet of one ordinary evening, sitting at my desk with the faint hum of the city outside, that I began to understand the depth of the journey I had been on. The months, perhaps even years, of reflection, subtle experimentation, and deliberate attention had coalesced into something I could name only with difficulty. Not a transformation, not a revelation, but an emergence, the slow, persistent unfolding of a self more fully attentive, more fully ethical, more fully present. Melissa had become neither a mask nor a persona, nor even a hypothetical other to try on. She was a lens, a companion, a mirror of intention. She had taught me to notice, to question, to inhabit ambiguity without fear, and to act with integrity in the spaces between certainty and possibility. I realized that the journey was never about the approval of others, nor about dramatic gestures or milestones. It was about alignment, the alignment of thought, feeling, action, and consequence. I began to reflect on the social worlds I inhabited, the family, friends, colleagues, and strangers who, in subtle ways, responded to the shifts I had made. I understood that identity is not a solitary phenomenon, it exists in the interplay of perception, attention, and interpretation. Each choice I made, how I spoke, how I moved, how I dressed, rippled outward, influencing those around me. Melissa had taught me that this was not a burden but an ethical responsibility. To inhabit oneself attentively is to acknowledge the impact one has on others, and to navigate that impact with empathy and care. Home had become both sanctuary and laboratory. My mother's steady presence, quiet attentiveness, and unspoken validation were gifts I had come to recognize fully. I understood her dreams, the ones she had shared with me, not as prescriptive visions but as reflections of perception, of care, and of the subtle ways we witness one another. The dream had been a catalyst, but the work, the real, slow, patient work, was mine alone. It required courage, reflection, and relentless honesty. Friendships and social connections had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Some relationships deepened, others faded, and a few were recalibrated entirely. I learned to navigate these changes with integrity, understanding that the ethical dimension of identity is inseparable from relational dynamics. To honor myself was to honor others, to inhabit ambiguity with courage was to practice empathy and patience. Melissa was the framework through which I observed these dynamics, guiding reflection without dictating action, offering perspective without pressure. Even routine acts, walking, cooking, folding laundry, conversing with strangers, were imbued with significance. Each gesture, each choice, became a site for observation and ethical inquiry. I realized that transformation is not necessarily external or performative, it is lived in the repetition of conscientious, attentive choices. The moral and emotional weight of identity resides in these small, persistent acts, and in the courage to act in alignment with self-awareness and empathy. Emotionally, I felt a profound integration. Fear, doubt, and self-consciousness remained, but they no longer dictated my actions. I had learned to inhabit uncertainty without panic, to explore identity without erasure, to practice honesty without harm. Melissa's presence, persistent yet gentle, allowed me to frame discomfort as opportunity, tension as information, curiosity as ethical engagement. The work was ongoing, continuous, and fundamentally human. Reflection became a daily practice. I kept a journal, wrote letters I did not send, and allowed myself to inhabit thought and feeling without judgment. I confronted assumptions, questioned internalized norms, and considered the consequences of choices large and small. I learned that identity is iterative, it evolves, expands, contracts, and reconfigures in response to reflection, observation, and experience. Melissa was the constant in this iterative process, not as a solution but as a guide. Ultimately, I realized that identity is inseparable from responsibility to oneself, to others, and to the ethical life we inhabit in everyday practice. To explore oneself with courage is to navigate consequence thoughtfully, to act authentically is to act ethically. Melissa had become a conduit for these realizations, not a replacement of Mike, but an expansion of him. She allowed me to see myself with clarity, empathy, and intentionality. And in that quiet evening, I allowed the name to surface fully, without hesitation or apology. Melissa was not a mask, not a role, not a fantasy. She was the lived expression of attention, curiosity, courage, and empathy. She was the lens through which I could inhabit life with integrity, the companion that allowed me to navigate uncertainty, the presence that reminded me that transformation is a process of observation, reflection, and ethical engagement. By the time I closed my journal, the realization had settled in with a kind of calm weight. Identity is never fixed, never finished, never solely internal or external. It is continuous, relational, ethical, and deeply human. Melissa was no longer a question, though uncertainty remained. She was the ongoing practice of attentive living, the subtle expansion of self, the persistent invitation to act with honesty, empathy, and courage. I lay back, the hum of the city outside soft in my ears, and for the first time fully understood that the journey was not about becoming someone else, but about inhabiting the self one had always been in ways that honored both personal truth and relational responsibility. Melissa had emerged, not as a destination, but as a way of living, reflecting, and being in the world with attentiveness and integrity. The journey continues, quietly, persistently, ethically, and beautifully. Sitting quietly now, months after the first stirrings of Melissa in my mind, I can trace the path that led here, not in milestones, not in sudden revelations, but in countless small, deliberate choices that added up to something larger than I had expected. It is strange, in a way, to feel both the weight and the lightness of identity, as though every decision I've made has layered upon the last to create a self I can inhabit with attention, integrity, and care. Melissa is no longer a distant question, though uncertainty remains. She is a presence, a lens, a reminder of the possibility in observation and reflection. She represents the courage to inhabit ambiguity, to notice myself and the people around me with equal attentiveness, and to act ethically within the messy, relational, unpredictable spaces of life. She is, in every subtle choice, a companion in accountability, ethical, emotional, and social. I have learned that identity is not a fixed border to defend, nor a performance to display. It is iterative, relational, and profoundly human. Each gesture, each word, each decision, even the most mundane, carries consequence. Choosing honesty, curiosity, and empathy repeatedly is the slow, quiet work of transformation. I have come to see that courage is not in grand declarations, but in the patient attention to the self and the care extended to others. And in that realization lies a kind of freedom not from responsibility, but through it. Freedom not from consequence, but by acting with awareness. Freedom not from uncertainty, but in learning to inhabit it without fear. Melissa has taught me that transformation is a continuous practice, one that deepens with reflection, observation, and intentionality. Looking back, I understand now that my mother's dream was not a prophecy or a prescription. It was a mirror, an invitation, a moment that asked me to see myself in ways I had never permitted. From that quiet beginning, a journey unfolded that reshaped not just how I am seen, but how I see myself, and how I act in the world. The journey continues, not as a story of extremes, but as a lived practice of alignment, empathy, courage, and ethical presence. Melissa is no longer just a dream, nor merely a question. She is the living work of attention, the reflection of possibility, and the quiet, persistent reminder that to inhabit life with honesty and care is both the challenge and the gift of being human.